This lecture is a brief overview of birth control in the early 20th century United States. So basically 1900, 1910 through the 1930s into the 40s. When I was doing the research to put this lecture together, I discovered that I didn't know nearly as much as I thought I did about the history of birth control in this era. So I hope you'll find this as interesting as I did. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, the status of contraception was that it was illegal, it was unregulated, and it was widely available. So the Comstock Law banned people from sending contraception or information about contraception through the mail. There were also a number of state laws against the sale of contraception. In addition to that, there was, of course, no state regulation. The first federal health regulations come with the creation of the FDA in 1906. The FDA's policy is that pregnancy is not a disease. So testing to devices to see if they actually do what they say they do to prevent pregnancy is not within their remit. It's not part of their job, according to the FDA. However, despite the fact that this is illegal, they become very good at working around the illegal designation. And basically what they do is they sell these claiming it's for health, matters of health or hygiene. Condoms are to prevent catching diseases. Douches are to wash away germs. All these various different things they try to claim are for reasons of health and hygiene. They're not for reasons of contraception. So you could often get a hold of them fairly easily, despite the laws. Then there is this radical challenge. And so people had been arguing for the availability of contraception, what becomes named birth control in 1914, from a radical point of view. And that comes from the history of free love, advocates of free love in the United States, people who argue that love connections and sex should not be bound simply by marriage, that it should be a connection of deep love, and that may or may not align with marriage, but that you should have the freedom to act as your emotions dictate. More than that, there's the argument that women should have the right to decide whether or not they are going to have children. And historically, the advocates of voluntary motherhood had focused on the idea of women being able to say no to sex, even being able to say no to their husbands, which was a big deal. Remember, what we would call marital rape didn't exist back then. If a husband wanted to have sex with his wife, that was his right. They start to argue in the early 20th century that it could be also a question of having access to contraception, so a woman could have sex but not get pregnant. Margaret Sanger is a nurse who gets involved with these free thinkers, these radicals, and so she starts publishing The Woman Rebel, very radical, as you can see here, no gods, no masters. That promptly gets arrested. And then she also tries to open up a birth control clinic with her sister in Brownville in New York in 1915. And very shortly after opening, it gets closed down by the state for being an illegal distribution of contraception. At pretty much the same time that Margaret Sanger's getting involved, the military is having a struggle over the problem of syphilis and gonorrhea. They have discovered that lots of their soldiers and a lot of their sailors are infected with syphilis and gonorrhea. In fact, a lot of the American population is infected. They have just identified the two diseases so that you can actually do a microscope test and see what they have, that it's an actual specific disease. They don't really have anything to treat gonorrhea with that's effective. They think they have a way to treat syphilis through the use of mercury and then later salvarsan, but it's not very effective. So they have a treatment, but it's not really any good. They begin experimenting in the Navy with the idea of providing prophylactics to help prevent men from getting infected. It basically means wiping their penises with things to clean them up so they won't get disease. But the new Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, is a fundamentalist Christian, and he believes that this is simply going to encourage the men to have sex when they shouldn't. You're encouraging them to do immoral things. So he bans the prophylaxis program. The Army does pretty much the same thing. And they start heading into World War I, and suddenly you're getting all of these soldiers coming in. And a lot of them are infected. Mostly they're infected on American soil, though some get infected later on overseas. And so they have to take a step back to using prophylaxis again. They literally wait until Josephus Daniels is out of the office and get his undersecretary, which was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to sign the paperwork. So he didn't have to see that they were doing that. But what they end up doing, a lot of the protection against venereal disease is actually done by targeting young women, girls and young women. If you are found as a young woman hanging around the camp where the soldiers, the sailors are, you face possible arrest. If you're found to be infected with syphilis or gonorrhea, you may actually be interned until you are no longer infected. If you're underage, you could actually be interned until you become of age. So their most common way of trying to deal with the problem is basically targeting women. The thing is, everybody else, all the other soldiers, our allies, are using condoms. And so once they get overseas, American soldiers and sailors become very quickly exposed to the use of condoms. In some cases, they're given by their sexual partners. In some cases, they're passed on from soldiers from other armies. And they basically decide that these are a great convenience, highly useful, and they bring them back home with them, and the use of condoms as a good thing. Now, this is made easier by a decision in 1918, People versus Sanger. What it decides is, and this is after the clinic is shut down, on grounds of it was distributing contraception. What People versus Sanger on appeal gets decided is that while distributing contraception is illegal, if what you're distributing is for purposes of health, medicine, then it can be distributed. And the decision basically says by physicians and medical professionals, but they read that very broadly, and condom manufacturers take off because they take that as basically licensed to sell as long as they don't advertise it as having contraceptive uses. You simply say that you're using it for reasons of health. And so condoms are available in drugstores, of course, but they're also available in things like waiters at restaurants' pockets, newsstands, all over the place. You can easily get a hold of a condom. OTC meaning over-the-counter availability. That same decision leads a way forward for Margaret Sanger. And what she does, and this is partly influenced by the fact that she spends time in Europe and seeing how different clinics operate there, is that they're going to build on that medical exception. That what they're going to argue is that while contraception in general may be illegal to distribute, it should be legal for physicians to distribute. So when she founds the American Birth Control League in 1921 and starts opening up new clinics, the big focus is on courting the American Medical Association, convincing them that they should support contraception as something to be prescribed by physicians. And in fact, when she opens the new clinics, the first one, she has a female physician in charge who is able to do various studies to prove what the clinics are focusing on is distribution of diaphragms. And she's able to do research and show the effectiveness of diaphragm when used correctly and fitted by a physician. So the diaphragm becomes Birth Control League, or what later becomes Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger model of birth control. And the diaphragm is to be fitted by physicians, sold through physicians and pharmacies, so you can have a good markup and profit on this if you're a physician. There's a whole backstory about how Sanger helps start a particular diaphragm making company, and sort of out of gratitude and also because it helps catch other possible clients. They do provide diaphragms at a discount to the Planned Parenthood clinics. It is the highest recommended use of birth control, and it has been demonstrated in multiple studies, which are done at Planned Parenthood clinics where they're using diaphragms. They study the effectiveness of diaphragms. They find they're effective if used correctly. And so it becomes basically almost what almost all physicians are going to recommend and what the clinics are going to recommend if you're going for help. In exchange for that, they are not sold directly to the public. So this advertisement, for example, is, when the family grows too fast, does she know that only you being the physician, can help by getting the prescriptions for these spermicide jellies and diaphragms? The thing is, though, the diaphragms require you to be very intimately acquainted with parts of your anatomy that a lot of women were taught not to look at. It can be uncomfortable in the process of learning how to use it. It needs to be cleaned and sterilized, which is something that can be difficult if you don't have running water. It requires spermicidal jelly to be fully effective. And it requires an expensive visit to a physician for a lot of people because birth control clinics are not available everywhere, particularly if you're someone in a rural area. So in practice, a certain number, maybe 20% or so, of middle-class women use diaphragms, but very few working-class and poor women use diaphragms. And they turn to other alternatives. Now, one of the things you're usually going to hear is that the birth control movement was tied up in eugenics. And eugenic thinking did play a role. Eugenics was extremely popular. It's not really surprising that Margaret Sanger had some eugenic thinking. It would be much more surprising if she didn't. It was influential among reformers of all types, including some African American reformers who feel that the path forward is to have better babies. It's also tied to fears of social welfare costs. And you can sort of see these in this charts here, where you have poverty leads to ignorance leads to overlarge families lead to poverty. And you can sort of see this as this ongoing cycle. And then in here, what they're showing you is that New York City family life likes bigger families. So the average family size is 3.4, but families on relief, in other words, getting help during the Depression, have average family size of 5.3. And then over here, another chart showing that 1/2 of all babies are born to the lowest income families. So there is this fear that the wrong people are having too many babies. And that's partly tied to eugenic thinking and partly tied to social welfare thinking. In addition to that, though, and Margaret Sanger is very aware of this, they're also looking at a reality, which is that poor women have less control over how many children they're going to have. And poor women are more likely to have infant deaths. And poorer women are more likely to have bad health outcomes from childbirth and pregnancy. So I think saying that poor people, poor women need access to birth control, on the one hand, it does lean to these social controller theories of eugenics, fears of helping people. But it also does reflect a real problem and vulnerability that affects poor women in the United States at that time and today. The problem with Planned Parenthood is it doesn't actually serve most women. There's a limited number of clinics, though they're rapidly growing. The clinics are supposed to serve everybody, but everybody does not necessarily include African American women, and often African American women will be asked to come at certain times of the week, certain days. Private physicians charge too much money and may not be available depending on where you live, and may not be willing to serve you if you're Black. The other thing is there's a lot of discomfort with doctors. Women have been raised to be quiet about their body, and particularly about their private parts of their body. And so a lot of them have a hard time talking to a doctor about what's going on with their body and how they might need help and what difficulties they might find. All of those topics, for some women, are very hard to communicate, so they don't really like going to doctors for help. And then finally, like I sort of said, a lot of women are dissatisfied with diaphragms, which are sort of the official best form of contraception. So what do? They turn to feminine hygiene products. And feminine hygiene is the code word for a whole array of products that theoretically you take for reasons of health or hygiene, but in fact are supposed to have contraceptive effects. These are available over the counter. You get them through the mail. You can get them in certain shop catalogs. You can buy them in stores. There are often drugstores have special areas which have feminine hygiene products, and the idea is that those are supposed to be shut off so women can be private there and go and look into and make decisions about that. The problem is, like I said earlier, they're unregulated. FDA says pregnancy is not a disease, therefore they do not have to try to judge whether contraceptives are effective at preventing disease. So a lot of what's available is ineffective and sometimes, often, dangerous. Those 3 ads you're seeing there are for Lysol, probably the most popular form of feminine hygiene is the douche, and the one that sells the best is Lysol. And so you have here these 3 ads that are basically saying, how your marriage is going to be damaged because you don't take care of that feminine hygiene. At the same time, douches don't prevent pregnancy. Lysol was even harsher than it is today for most of the 20th century. They change it slightly to make it a little less harsh and less, they're worried about one ingredient being carcinogenic, so they get rid of that. But It can be damaging. It can cause chemical burns depending on how strongly you use it. And it certainly does not prevent pregnancy. So it's a situation where women are doing their best to try to control birth control. But the tools that they have to use are often not really usable. Condoms, on the other hand, are different. And there is a series of changes in the business. They moved to using latex because the rubber they were using before easily was set on fire and they had problems with factories burning down and things. The big businesses consolidate, and then in 1938, the FDA announces that they are going to start regulating condoms. Now, the argument is they're regulating them for the sake of prevention of venereal disease, that preventing syphilis and gonorrhea is the purpose of a condom. So they're going to check them and see if they have any holes and things like that. And so the FDA begins regulation. The large condom makers who can afford it add checking for quality as part of their production process. And they increasingly make deals with drugstores that's where they're primarily going to distribute those condoms. Trojan's one of the big ones. There's a few others. Paul Schmidz has a set of multiple lines of condoms, and he's the other big producer of condoms. When it comes time for World War II, there's no question. Condoms are provided to the troops. How does this fit in with African American people? It's something that the Black community is interested in, obviously. There are advocates, usually men, who argue that birth control is a plot, that birth control is meant to prevent the growth of the Black population, and that women should not use it, and men should not use it. That's one argument. Marcus Garvey makes that argument. Some other men make that argument. Then you have somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois, who seems to be saying, we need to invest more in fewer children. So have fewer children, but put a lot of investment, a lot of education, a lot of care into those fewer children so they can advance. There's also the viewpoint that this is an important thing for Black women's health, because it is. It's a real health danger, having too many children. And more than that, pretty much from the beginning, when Black women talk about birth control, they talk about it in the larger context of having meaningful choices. In other words, being able to choose whether you're going to have a child or not have a child. You need contraception to help you make that choice safely. But also, they see it as linked to the lack of access to health care, impoverishment, and other things that make it hard to have a child safely and to raise that child well. Planned Parenthood does try to reach out to the Black community, but it doesn't go as well as it could. I mentioned earlier that often there was limited access to clinics before World War II. They set up a clinic in Harlem in 1930 that was supported by a lot of Black cultural and intellectual leaders. W.B. Du Bois is once again involved. I think Mary McLeod Bethune. Others are in support of the Harlem Clinic. It has some problems. There's power struggles in terms of, the Black advocates have to fight to get it staffed by Black nurses. Things like that are sort of an ongoing problem, but it serves many people. Some white people too, as well as the larger Black community. And then there's an attempt at a Negro project where the idea is they're going to bring contraception to Black people in the rural South. The people who were planning the program were white. They did some consultation with Black thinkers, not as much as they should. They do hire Black nurses, but there are white doctors. There's a lot of distrust from the local Black people about what they're there actually for. And so it's really not an effective program that dies out. So, yeah. So there's people like Margaret Sanger want to see themselves as open across racial lines, but in terms of effective service, it doesn't necessarily happen. There also are specifically Black initiatives in the way of birth control. So there are local clinics that are started up by Black women organizations to try to make contraception available and birth control advice available. Places like churches, other places, just to get the information and resources out in the Black community. There's the Alpha Kappa Alpha Project, Mississippi Project. Dr. Dorothy Farabee, I hope I'm saying that correctly. She was an Alpha Kappa Alpha member and a doctor, a Black woman doctor. And she's very passionate about giving access to contraception and also giving access to health services for Black people in rural areas. And so they set up the Mississippi Project. Over a series of summers, Alpha Kappa Alpha alums, Black women, will come down and provide health care to people in Mississippi. And that's a picture of the doctor there doing that. The thing is, they'll provide things like vaccines, basic health checks, and then they would offer contraception. So they're offering contraception, but they're doing it within a larger context of healthcare. And then finally, the National Council of Negro Women, which brings together a lot of Black women clubs, endorses birth control in 1941. But once again, that endorsement comes with a statement that it's important to make it meaningful for women to safely have children when they choose, as well as the ability to safely decide not to have children. So what are the conclusions? Officially, contraception becomes a medicalized thing. You are supposed to go to the doctor to get it. You're not supposed to just get it over the counter or by yourself. But the reality is that does not convince many American women that that's the way they want to go. The clinics are limited in where they are. Physicians are limited in terms of where you can get access to them, whether they think you're the right person to get birth control, which would always be a big issue. Are you a married woman? That's the only woman who should be getting birth control. So they choose usually to use over-the-counter offerings. Unfortunately, while condoms by the end of the 1930s are pretty safe, tested, and good, a lot of what is available for women is not effective, and in some cases is actively dangerous. And then finally, I think it's worth noting that there is a strong contingent of women and Black women who are interested and committed to making contraception available for Black women. But once again, they see it as fitting into this larger context of the poor care and poor health options that are available for Black women, both deciding not to have children, but also having children as well.